Hi there, everybody. Hope you're doing well today. This video is going to continue looking at empiricism in philosophy by looking at Locke and Hume's attempts to argue in favor of this claim that our ideas all must come from experience. We're going to start out the video just by trying to clarify, well, what do we mean by an idea? And that'll lead into distinguishing between two kinds of ideas, simple and complex. And that'll allow us to clarify this concept empiricist thesis that our ideas come from experience or sensation, whatever it might be. And then we'll talk about the arguments in favor of this thesis. All right, so if we claim that all of our ideas are acquired via experience, well, we should probably think a little bit about, well, what do we mean by an idea? What are these things that are supposed to be coming from experience? So here's where Locke first introduces this term idea. He says, I must beg pardon my reader for the frequent use of the word idea. So he basically says, look, I apologize. I'm going to talk about ideas quite a bit here. I'm going to repeat this term over and over. But he says, this is because it being that term which I think serves best to stand for whatever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. She says this word is just meant to stand for whatever it is. He's not going to give a definition, but whatever it is that we're using when we think about the world, when we think about things, when we reason, when we imagine, when we form beliefs, when we form desires. He says that's what I mean by an idea. We're all familiar with them through our own experience, through our own thoughts. We're familiar with ideas. Now, whatever that is, that's what I mean. Similarly, Hume does not try to give a definition of what an idea is. Instead, Hume tries to get us to understand what he means by idea by directing our attention to examples and then talking about some of the ways in which they are different from other things that might occur in our mind. So he says we may divide all the perceptions of the mind into two classes or species, and they are distinguished by their different degrees of force and vivacity. So we can notice the difference by paying attention to these differences in this feature of force and this feature of vivacity. He says, the less forcible and lively are commonly denominated thoughts or ideas. The other species, call them impressions, and so by the term impression then, I mean all our more lively perceptions when we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will. All right, so let's try to break this down here. Hume is distinguishing between two kinds of mental states, or as he calls them, perceptions of the mind. So two kinds of things that go on in our mind. So firstly, we have impressions, which he says are the more vivid and forceful of these mental states. And he gives an example like this is when we actually see or desire, hear, etc. And so your sensory experience when you're looking at a blue car in front of you, when you're actually seeing and experiencing the blue car, whatever it is that's occurring in your mind, that's the impression. It's very vivid, it's very forceful. But the ideas we have, the thoughts we have, these are the less vivid and forceful of our mental states. And then we can use Locke's claim that ideas are whatever the objects of our thought are, of our thinking are, to try to explain this claim. So an example of an idea or thought would be the mental state you're in when you merely think about a blue car without actually seeing or sensing one. So imagine you look at that blue car, it goes away, and now you're no longer seeing it. You can still imagine that blue car in your mind. You can still think about it, and you can wonder, were there two people or one people in that blue car? So there you are thinking about the blue car using the idea of the blue car. That idea, when you think about the blueness of the car after it's gone, well, that blueness isn't quite as vivid, isn't quite as forceful in your mind. And yet again, this isn't meant to be a definition of ideas and impressions. Instead, it's just meant to try to direct your attention and say, look, we all are aware of these in our own mind. We know the difference through our own experience. And so by pointing to these examples, we thereby are able to understand what Hume and what Locke mean by ideas and sensations or impressions, for instance. All right, so now, but Locke says there's one thing that is to be carefully observed concerning the ideas we have, and that is that some of them are simple and some complex. So firstly, there are these simple ideas, and there are these complex ideas. Now, the simple ideas Locke describes as being uncompounded and containing nothing but one uniform appearance or conception in the mind, and is not distinguishable into different ideas. So we can't take a simple idea and break it down into smaller parts. So an example of this would be our idea of a particular shade of red. So when you bring to mind a particular example of a shade to red that you imagine, that one uniform idea is a simple idea. Similarly, our idea of a very particular square shape is a simple idea. But complex ideas, they are composed of simpler ideas. They are distinguishable into different ideas. We can break them apart and find these smaller ideas that serve as pieces to build up those complex ideas. So an example here would be I can also think about not just red or a square, I can think about a red square. Now that idea is complex because it includes the idea of redness and the idea of squareness put together. It's composed out of those smaller parts to make this bigger, more complicated idea. Similarly, our idea of a bachelor can be distinguishable into the smaller ideas of something that is an adult, male, and the idea of it being unmarried. Those three ideas are parts or components that make up this bigger, more complex idea of a bachelor. So with those distinctions in mind, we can clarify what the concept empiricist thesis is. Now, Hume has a very famous statement of this kind of approach to thinking about our ideas, and it's often called Hume's copy principle. He says that all our ideas or more feeble perceptions, so these less vivid, less forceful mental states that we have that allow us to think about things in the world, those ideas are just copies of our impressions or more lively ones. So those experiences we have when we sense, feel, hear, see, desire, will, the experience of those impressions there, we make copies of them to thereby form these ideas that we can then use in our thinking even when the impressions are gone. But of course, we need to be very careful here because, strictly speaking, it's the simple ideas that are copies of our impressions. The complex ideas are then built out of those simple ideas. So these complex ideas, we can break them down into smaller parts, and each of those simple parts would be a copy from a previous impression. But the complex idea as a whole might not be. All right, so now, but why should we believe this? Why should we believe that every single idea is acquired from experience, or that each of its parts is acquired from experience, and there's nothing more to these ideas than that? Both Locke and Hume take concept empiricism, or this copy principle, to be an empirical thesis about how our mind works. All right, so what I mean by that is they don't think we can simply use our reason to determine whether ideas are innate or whether they are acquired from experience. This is something we need to go investigate and make observations to try to form evidence about where these come from. And so their arguments for empiricism are going to focus on appealing to observations we can make about the world that would serve as evidence that our concepts are acquired via experience. The first argument that Locke gives in favor of this empirical approach to the origin of our ideas goes as follows. He says, "He who attentively considers the state of a child at his first coming into the world will have little reason to think him stored with plenty of ideas that are able to be the matter of his future knowledge. It's by degrees he comes to be furnished with them, with these ideas." All right, so let's turn this into a more rigorous argument in terms of premises and conclusion. Let's call this the argument from child development because it's an argument that focuses on observations about how children develop their ideas over time. And so the claim here is that when we observe young children, they seem to possess very few ideas in their mind. And the younger the child, the fewer ideas they possess. All right, so an infant is going to have some ideas, but not very many, and they're going to have a lot less ideas than a 2-year-old. So the infant might not have the idea of a table, but the 2-year-old or 3-year-old might have that idea. And a child's development of ideas seems to advance in degrees over a long period of time. So it's not that all of a sudden all the ideas like pop into their mind all at once. They get a few more, and so that development of those ideas, they come into their mind slowly and over time and as a matter of degree. Now, Locke is essentially thinking that the best explanation of these facts about the development of ideas in children is that those ideas are acquired from experience. So the claim here is, look, why would young children only have a couple ideas and older children have more? And why would we see children get more and more ideas over time progressively on the hypothesis that our ideas are acquired from experience? This makes perfect sense. A younger child would have fewer ideas because they have fewer experiences in the world. And as they get older, they have more experiences, and so they'd have more ideas. And it makes sense why we wouldn't get all these ideas at once, because we don't have experiences of everything at once. We'd get some more experience, get some more ideas. Get some more experience, get some more ideas. So that is, if this empirical thesis was true, it can explain why we observe this particular progression of ideas through the development of children. And so, given that it gives us the simplest, best explanation, well, probably our ideas are acquired via experience in this way. Now, Locke gives a second argument, and he says, the ideas of obvious and familiar qualities imprint themselves before the memory begins to keep a register of time or order. Yet, it is often so late before some unusual qualities come in the way that there are few men who cannot recollect the beginning of their acquaintance with them. So his claim here is that there seems to be a certain order in which we develop our ideas. So there's some ideas I have of very obvious, familiar things like colors and shapes where I got those ideas so long ago that I just don't even really remember where I got them. I don't know where I got the idea of redness for the first time or squareness. Happened when I was really young. But there are some ideas I have that I distinctly do remember when and where I acquired them. For instance, my idea of the taste of Vegemite. I remember getting that idea when I was about 16 or 17 because I went to Australia where I found out they have this spread, Vegemite, that they put on food. And then I tried it, got the experience with that taste, and then I had that idea. Similarly, he says, hence we see the reason why it is pretty late before most children get ideas of the operation of their own minds. They make not deep impressions enough to leave in their mind clear, distinct, lasting ideas until the understanding turns inward upon itself, reflects on its operation, and makes them the objects of its own contemplation. So he's saying, look, it seems like we get ideas of things in the world, like tables, chairs, desks. We get those ideas before we get ideas about our own minds, like ideas about what a belief is, what a desire is, what a choice is, etc. So let's call this Locke's argument from order, because essentially it's saying, look, we observe a particular order in which ideas seem to develop. And this observation is meant to support this claim that we get our ideas from experience. So let's look at those observations first. The first observation was we seem to first get ideas of ordinary common things, and it's later in our life that we tend to get ideas of unusual rare things, like Vegemite. And then he says, similarly, it looks like we tend to first get ideas of sensation, ideas of tables, chairs, colors, and shapes, and then later in our life get ideas of reflection, ideas of belief, knowledge, willing, doubting, these ideas that involve thinking about our own mind. Locke thinks that the best explanation for why we get these kinds of ideas first and these other kinds of ideas later is this hypothesis that all of those ideas are coming from experience. And this seems to make sense. If we get our ideas from experience, well, notice if something is very common and ordinary, we're much more likely to get experience with it earlier in our life and develop those ideas early. If something is really rare and unusual, like Vegemite, and I live in the United States, well, I'm not very likely to encounter and experience Vegemite very early in my life. I had to go to Australia to get it. If something is rare and unusual, it's much less likely that I'll get experience with it until later, and so it makes more sense that I would acquire that concept later in life. Similarly, if I get my ideas about belief, knowledge, willing, doubting from experience myself forming beliefs, experiencing myself gaining knowledge or willing or doubting or making a choice, it looks like I would first have to get ideas about the world. Let me give an example here. Consider I have the idea of making a choice between chocolate and peanut butter. But notice, in order to get that idea, I'd have to experience myself making a choice between one thing and another, making a choice between peanut butter and chocolate. But in order to experience myself making that choice, I need to first get the ideas of chocolate and peanut butter before I can actually have my mind make the choice and experience myself making that choice. And so it makes sense that I have to get these ideas of sensation, chocolate and peanut butter, before I could get the idea of making a choice between things, the idea of a choice in my mind. Because I can't make that choice and experience it until I have the ideas of things that I'm going to make a choice between. And now this actually lines up with some modern psychology about children. Children seem to have ideas of the world around them before they get an idea of what a belief is. So children who are about 3 years old They can have an idea of, say, a ball and its location. But if I take that ball, put it in front of them, and there's an adult there, they see it put on the table, and then the adult leaves the room, and I put that ball and I hide it in a dresser. If you then ask the child, hey, where is the adult when they come back in the room? Where are they going to look for that ball? They'll say they're going to look for it in the dresser, because it looks like the child here doesn't actually have the idea of someone forming a belief that could be true or false. They don't have any idea of the distinction between reality, the ball, the dresser, and where it's located, reality, and how things appear in someone's mind. They don't have a theory of mind in terms of beliefs and false beliefs. It's not until around like 4 years old that children seem to develop this idea that other people can have beliefs, and those beliefs can either match reality or not. And so it looks like Locke is right. We seem to get these ideas of the world around us before we get an idea of the kinds of things that go on in people's minds, how things appear to them. And the claim here is that given that empiricism has this very straightforward explanation for why we would develop one idea before another, that seems to be a reason to believe that it's probably how we do acquire them. Now let's look at an argument that comes from Hume for concept empiricism. He says, when we analyze our ideas, however compounded or sublime, we always find that they resolve themselves into such simple ideas as were copied from a precedent feeling or sentiment. Even those ideas which seem the most wide of this origin are found to be derived from it. I'm going to call this the argument from analysis. The claim here is, look, for every idea we've considered, we can analyze that idea into simpler parts until we eventually arrive at ideas copied from a previous impression. So parts of it that we got from experience. And he says nobody's really found an idea that we can't do this with, that we can't just like break down into smaller parts and find that those parts come from past impressions that we've had. And so if every idea we've considered so far, if we haven't found any that we can't break down in this way, well, that's probably because all of our ideas are built in this way as copies of previous impressions. For a final argument, there's an argument that seems like both Locke and Hume both adopt. So Locke describes this argument by saying, I think it will be granted easily that if a child were kept in a place where he never saw any other but black and white until he were a man, so imagine raising a child in a black and white room where they never get to experience color, he says he'd have no more ideas of scarlet or green than he who from his childhood never tasted an oyster or a pineapple has of those particular relishes. Men then come to be furnished with fewer or more simple ideas, according as the objects they converse with afford greater or lesser variety. So if you take away the experience of certain colors, it looks like you would also take away the ideas of those colors. Similarly, Hume says, if it happen from a defect of the organ that a man is not susceptible of any species of sensation, we always find that he is as little susceptible of the correspondent ideas. So the claim here is sometimes people have defects with their organs so that they're not able to have certain kinds of impressions, certain kinds of sensations. And when they are losing that faculty, it looks like they also don't have the idea that would correspond to the sensations that they would have. And he gives examples. A blind man can form no notion, no idea of colors. A deaf man, no idea of sounds. We notice this correlation. When their organs don't allow them to have this experience or sensation, they also are not able to have the ideas in their mind. He says, and if you restore either of them that sense in which he is deficient, so you fix the blind man's vision, or you fix the deaf man's hearing, well, once you open up the ability to now get those new sensations, he thinks you'll also then see the ideas of color or of sound arise. So we see this correlation. When you take away the sensation, you take away the ideas. When you bring the sensations back, looks like you bring the ideas back. So let's call this the argument from correlation. The idea is whenever a person lacks a kind of experience, they also lack the corresponding ideas. So there's a correlation between not having the experience and not having the idea. And when a person gains the ability to have a kind of experience that they previously couldn't, they also gain the corresponding idea. So we see correlation between them getting the experience and them getting the idea. And now Locke also observes that there seems to be a correlation between the more kinds of experience has, the more ideas that that person possesses. And similarly, there's this correlation between the fewer kinds of experience a person has, the fewer ideas the person possesses. Well, these correlations between our experiences and ideas seems to be best explained by the theory that our ideas come from these experiences. If our ideas come from experience, then of course we'd see these correlations between missing the experience and missing the idea. And given that simple, straightforward explanation, well, probably that's the true explanation for how we get these ideas. So that does it for the arguments in favor of this claim that we get our ideas from experience. Later on, we'll look at some difficulties or some worries with this position as well. See you then. Bye-bye.